This is Tom Fox. Welcome to the newest edition in the Compliance Podcast Network, my latest podcast, Compliance and Coronavirus. As the voice of compliance, I wanted to start a podcast which will help bring both clarity and sanity to the field of compliance, the compliance practitioner, and indeed the compliance profession during this worldwide health and healthcare crisis. Taking up a variety of topics as diverse as working from home, to sporting events, to the role of the board of directors, to crisis management, to the role of supply chains. We will look at all of these in this podcast. If you have a topic you'd like covered on compliance and coronavirus, please let me know. I'd be happy to do a podcast on it. In this episode, I'm joined by Gabe Gumbs. Gabe is the Chief Innovation Officer at Spirion. He heads the Spirion product development team. In this episode, we consider some of the challenges around data in the age of coronavirus, some of the top questions he and his team are hearing, some of the trends that have been amplified as a result of COVID-19, and what Spirion's data discovery agent can bring to help in these areas. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode. And today I have with me Gabe Gumbs. Gabe is, I believe, Chief Innovation Officer at Spirion. And he is going to help us think through what are some of the issues around cybersecurity as we move from the health crisis phase of coronavirus to the reopening and whatever the next phase of this journey of 2020 is. So, Gabe, first of all, thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Gabe, what are maybe the three top questions you and your team at Spirion are hearing from your customer base during the time of the coronavirus health crisis and the economic dislocation?
One of the top questions was, how do we enable and empower our workforce to be able to securely handle data as they now move to a work from home setup? Many organizations, although we've lived in a largely boundaryless digital world, which is to say, a lot of things have moved to the cloud. Now we've equally pushed a lot of that concentric information out into people's home environments and onto their endpoints in those places. So the questions around how do we safely continue to conduct business as that data now has found its way outside of just the core of the organization.
So my wife, I'd worked from home for years, but my wife now works from home. And are those types of conversations not occurring at people that you would typically work with, but is that message being transcended down and communicated down to the individual employees working from home?
It is in different ways. And I do end up in some cases working directly with some of these folks. It's always very important for me. You mentioned my title or function there as innovation officer, understanding what problems the businesses are needing to solve for. Those conversations are starting to make their way down. A lot of them in terms of just basic education and further helping the workforce understand how they should be handling that data.
Gabe, as we move from the perhaps the first phase, or at least the first 2 months of the coronavirus health crisis into this reopening, are the challenges changing, or are new challenges appearing, or are they just kind of growths from the prior challenges you talked about?
It's all of the above. There's certainly one challenge in particular that is growing, if you would, which is the sharing of health information. So we've been sharing health information for a long time. So long, in fact, that back in 1996, we adopted HIPAA, which stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. The P in there being very important, the portability, the ability to move that data around, that health data around. Well, as we enter into this next phase of COVID, et cetera, there are a number of different data sharing activities that are occurring all around health data, everything from contact tracing to just medical research and a lot of analysis of data. So that problem is amplified now at the moment. There's no shortage of other challenges that have equally made their way into the world today as well. It is a census year, and that equally meant that universities and institutions of the like have to report on on living data back to DHS, so the Department of Health and Human Services. And so as students are affected by this as well, and as people aren't going to same campuses, or maybe they're now transitioning to different types of work environments and schooling environments, the sharing of that information has also changed. So there's a lot of new challenges, but there's a lot of old ones that are now just magnified.
So that's fascinating. Does HIPAA provide any sort of framework or perhaps even kind of theoretical guidance for the conversations that you're engaging in now? You're the first person I've heard tie the original HIPAA into perhaps where we are now and where we may need to take this extraordinarily sensitive health data that corporations are now obtaining.
The good news is HIPAA does have some things already tied in this. Again, having been around since '96, it's had some time to really get some of the kinks out of the system. And one of those things is around how do we securely share that personal data. So they have very explicit guidelines around how one can de-identify and anonymize data sets prior to sharing them for research purposes, et cetera. So they very carefully articulate what a de-identified data set looks like versus one that isn't, and how to ensure that that data set can't be re-identified either intentionally or unintentionally based on what the output of it is. So there are resources around those that HIPAA and guidance that HIPAA has been providing for quite some time.
So as we move into the reopening now and trying to do business literally across the globe from home, are there yet another set of challenges that you're having to counsel people on, or at least in your community, you're having discussions around beyond the personal health data and the basic cybersecurity issues you've already told us about?
I'm sure there's some additional conversations on the periphery that might pop into mind, but I'll tell you that these two in particular dominate the conversation. How do we ensure we know what sensitive information our employees are handling now that they aren't directly tied to the corporate environment the way they were? And how, as a business, do I continue to use and transact on this data, monetize the data even, while doing so in a way that allows us to stay within the boundaries of compliance, but that also does now allow us to share those things for the greater general purpose of community health. As
states are reopening on a tiered or a multi-phase basis, you're in Florida, I'm in Texas. Our states opened perhaps faster than New York, Massachusetts, or California. How are you advising clients to think through not the reopening phases, but the differences in data privacy requirements? Do you advise just taking the most stringent and utilizing that across the country, or can you actually do a managed risk approach for multiple states?
It's a good question. So the number one bit of counsel I give them is, from a data classification perspective, you have to ensure that you're using some form of what we call a privacy grade classification system, right? Which means that you're able to classify data based on its process, its purpose, and preference. And the reason why these three classifications are very important is that regardless of what happens 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 18 months from now, if you've classified data based on its process, namely, how do I use this information as part of a business process? Is that business process one that's tied to HR activities, or it's one that's tied to order fulfillment activities? Versus what is the purpose for having this data in the first place? Is it data that is associated with research, or data that I bought or sold with a third party? As well as classifying it based on preference. Namely, does the individual that now under GDPR and CCPA have the right to data erasure? Have they notified us as such that this information needs to be? And if it's health data, for example, how do I make sure that the preference of protected health information is classified as such? If you are purposefully classifying data right now based on process, purpose, and preference, regardless of what happens throughout these next several months and years in reopening stages, you should be able to address those data concerns, security and privacy concerns, even retroactively or rapidly respond to them, if you would.
So that brings up a really interesting point in the anti-corruption compliance world, in the financial crimes compliance world, in the export control compliance world. The regulators have made clear that whatever the economic situation you're in right now, in 2, 3, 4 years from now, if we're looking at your actions in Q2 of 2020, we're not going to countenance the fact that you did not follow your internal compliance program or whatever regulatory regime you were under, meaning you still had to do compliance. Does that hold true in your world as well?
It does hold very true. In fact, a lot of folks were somewhat worried that given the rapid response that was necessary with COVID, that some of these privacy concerns would have been laxed a bit. And no such thing happened. In fact, all of the regulatory bodies explicitly stated that there is no lax period. Yes, we are under a pandemic, but no, that does not exclude you from having to protect health information under HIPAA guidelines. No, it does not exclude you from having to adhere to CCPA and GDPR. You are still very much responsible for doing those things.
There was one resource I found on the Spirion website that I wanted to specifically ask you about, and that was the data discovery agent. I wanted to ask you what that is and what that does and how that might help someone sort of in this time frame.
So what we did as part of our own community efforts to help those organizations that were rapidly trying to respond to this is we have a program whereby they could grab that agent and they could quickly do an assessment of their environment and their work from home environment to understand what data is out there and how they can begin addressing it. So basically, what you can think of it as a version of the Spirion solution that allows them to very quickly do that without having to fully commit to the longer term product, if you would.
So, Gabe, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I was wondering if listeners wanted more information on the data discovery agent or Spirion's great set of resources around the coronavirus health crisis and the current economic situation. Where could they go?
Yeah, I appreciate it. So absolutely stop by www.spirion.com. You can find us there. You can find that resource under the resource page. Right on the home page on the banner, you'll also see where that agent is. We have a podcast as well, the Privacy Please podcast, where we discuss privacy issues and challenges of the day with industry experts as well. And you can also find us on Twitter at Spirion, or you can find myself at Gabriel Gumbs.
Well, Gabe, as we move forward into Q3 and Q4, it may be that we have new challenges in the cybersecurity and data privacy world, and I hope that perhaps I could call upon you again for another chat.
I'd love to have it. I appreciate you having me on.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance and Coronavirus. This podcast posts 3 times a week at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of each week. That's 10 a.m. Central Time. I hope you will check out our episodes as we post during this health crisis and economic dislocation. This month on The Compliance Life, I'm featuring Ryan Robillé, who talks about his journey to the CCO chair. I hope you'll join me for another episode of Compliance and Coronavirus, where I bring clarity and sanity to the business executive and compliance professional around these most serious issues.